Hi, and this week's presentation we're going to be looking at something we've seen a little before but been ignoring up until now, and this is a new category of elements called complementisers. It turns out this is a very small set of words. In fact, there are only three of them, but we will see throughout the next few presentations that complementisers actually, although there are a few in number, are actually very important in terms of the syntax of sentences. Before we get there, let's have a recap about what we've said so far, about the general X-bar theory and the kinds of phrases that we've seen. X-bar theory says that there are two levels above the head of any phrase. The head is at the bottom, known as the zero level of projection. Above that is the X-bar with one bar on it. That's the first level of projection. And then above that is the X with two bars on it, sometimes called the X double bar, or equivalently the XP. Now, we've applied this analysis to both clauses and to nominal phrases. With a clause, the claim has been that the inflection is the head of the clause. So the clause is an inflection phrase. The claim for nominal phrases is that determiners are the heads of these. So these are DPs. Now inside each of these phrases, there are two positions, if we don't expand them involving adjuncts as well, but basically there are two extra positions inside these phrases. The one that is sister to the head and underneath the first projection, the X bar, is called the complement position. And in IPs, the complement is always a VP. And in DPs, the complement is always an NP. This is because inflections and determiners are a particular type of heads. They are what we call functional categories, and functional categories always have a very restricted complement. With an I, there's always a VP complement and never anything else, and never not a VP complement. With the D, it's always an NP complement if it's there, but there's not always a complement. Say, for example, if the determiner is a pronoun. Pronouns are determiners that don't have complements at all. So there's a little bit of variation there, but not much. Basically, functional heads always have an extremely limited set of possible complements. The other position inside the phrase is the higher one, sister to the X bar, daughter of the XP, and this we call the specifier. Okay, now the specifier is not the same as the complement. It's obviously in a different position. In English, complements follow the heads, where specifiers precede the heads. They have various functions, and that depends on which phrase you're looking at. So, for example, in the IP, the specifier is the place where the subject of the sentence sits. But in the DP, that's the place where the possessor sits. Okay, so that's a basic recap of what we've said about particular phrases and how X-bar theory analyzes those. Let's move on now to look at the complementisers themselves. Complementisers are things which appear only in embedded clauses and not always in an embedded clause. We've got an example here of an embedded clause, that is John will win, is a clause embedded inside another bigger clause, I think John will win. Now this IP is sitting in this complement position of the verb to think. It states what it is that's thought. So I think something, and the thing that I think is John will win. Okay, so the clause here is the complement of the verb. And there's no complementizer there, but there could be. The word that sits in between the complement clause and the verb think that takes that clause as its complement. Okay, so that is a complementizer. Now, they're strange elements because, well, the fact that it's optional here would seem to suggest that it doesn't really play any role in the, certainly not in the meaning of the sentence, because you can leave it out and you don't have any change in the meaning. I think John will win means exactly the same thing as I think that John will win. Okay, so the addition of the that there doesn't seem to add anything to the meaning of the sentence. However, it's not true that the complementizer that is always optional. It depends on which position it's in. So, for example, if you have an IP in the subject position of a clause like this one, that John will win is certain. Okay, John will win there is an IP sitting in the specifier position of another IP. And then note the complementizer again precedes the IP, but it's ungrammatical to miss it out. You can't miss the complementizer out when the IP is in the subject position. So it's not true that the complementizer is always optional, but it is in certain positions, particularly in the complement position. Now, that is one complementizer. There are others. For example, look at this one. Here we've got an embedded non-finite clause, in particular, an infinitive with the inflection position filled by this infinitive to. Okay, so John to win is the inflectional phrase. That is functioning as the complement of the adjective anxious. Okay, anxious is the kind of adjective that takes a clausal complement. And in this case, we've got this word for between the head anxious and its complement, John to win. That's the same place as the complementizer that went in with think that John will win. Okay, so for here would seem to be the same sort of thing. Again, it's not entirely clear what it's doing there. However, in this case, it's actually ungrammatical to miss it out, even though this clause is in a complement position. So for is not exactly like that. It turns out that for, when it appears, has to appear in any position. Okay, so you can't say, I am anxious, John, to win. You also get it when the clause is sitting in the subject position, just like with that. So for John to win would be nice. And again, similarly to that in this case, it's not optional when the clause is in the subject position. So you can't say John to win would be nice. The last one to look at is the complementizer if. Again, it sits in exactly the same position. It sits in front of an embedded clause. The clause in this case is the complement of the verb to wonder. I wonder if John will win. Now here the clause is a finite clause. It's got a modal auxiliary in its inflection position. It could have had tense there, so I wonder if John won, for example, might be okay. So in that case, this if is a bit like the that. The that is the one, the complementizer which introduces finite clauses, where for seems to be the one that introduces the infinitives. Now if that's true, then the question arises, what's the difference between if and that? When do you use the if complementizer? When do you use the that complementizer? Well, it seems that these complementizers accompany different verbs. With wonder, you get if. With think, you get that. Okay, so it seems that when you use if or that depends on the verb that takes the clause as its complement. Now, what's the difference between these verbs? Well, wonder and the kinds of verbs that take an if complementizer, verbs like wonder, to ask or to inquire. I wonder if, I asked if, I inquired if. These are all verbs that can take interrogative complements, that is, complement clauses that ask questions like who will win. You can say, I wonder who will win, I asked who will win, I inquired who will win. Okay, so these kinds of clauses take interrogative complement clauses. Verbs like think, however, don't take interrogative complementizers. You can't say, I think who will win, or I said who will win, or I believe who will win. These kinds of verbs only take what are called declarative clauses. That's non-interrogative clauses, clauses that don't ask questions but make statements. So clauses can come in either interrogative or declarative clauses, and those clauses can be the complements of different verbs depending on what the verb selects. Remember, verbs impose selectional restrictions on what their complements can be. Some verbs will take interrogative clauses, things like wonder. Some verbs will take declarative clausal complements, verbs like think. Now, that said, it looks therefore that if is something which accompanies an interrogative clause. So I wonder if John will win. John will win here is interrogative because it's the complement of wonder. And the if is the thing that seems to be marking this as the interrogative. With that, it seems as though that marks a declarative clause. So that's the difference between if and that. Now, if is like for in that whenever it appears, it has to appear. So you can't miss it out. So unlike the that, which is optional when the clause is in the complement position, if isn't. You can't say, I wonder John will win. You need the if to mark that clause as being interrogative. However, it's the same as the other kinds of clauses in as much as it appears when the clause is also in the subject position. So if John will win is an interesting question, there John will win is sitting in the subject position. And again, in this position, the if is not optional. You've got to have it there. So complementisers in general seem to be obligatory elements of clauses. It's only in this one case where we got an instance where it's optional, that is with the complementizer that when the clause is sitting in the complement position. So it seems to be different types of complementizers. We can see that their differences are in two axes. They differ in terms of whether or not they introduce finite or non-finite clauses, and they differ in terms of whether they introduce interrogative or declarative clauses. Now we can represent these distinctions in terms of what are called binary features, features that come in either a plus or a minus kind. So we can have finite, which is plus fin, or non-finite, minus fin. Interrogatives are plus WH. The WH indicates interrogative because this is based on those kinds of words which begin with WH, like which, what, where, why, who, and how. Okay, so how doesn't have the W, but it does have the H. These are interrogative pronouns. They're pronouns that are used to ask questions. So a general term for interrogative or a shorthand form is WH for interrogative. Plus WH is obviously interrogative. Minus WH then is going to be declarative, okay, not interrogative. Now, looking at this then, we've got four spaces for complementizers if we subclassify them in terms of these features. Clearly, the complementizer that is plus finite, it introduces finite clauses, and minus WH, it's the declarative complementizer. For, on the other hand, is minus finite plus minus WH. It introduces non-finite clauses, specifically the infinitive, and those are declarative clauses. If is the interrogative complementizer, so it's plus WH, and it introduces finite clauses. Note that leaves us one gap there. And it turns out English doesn't have a complementizer for introducing interrogative non-finite clauses. We just don't have one. That seems to be an accidental gap in that respect. Okay, so now we know what complementisers are and what the different complementisers look like and how they differ from each other. Let's consider the next question, that is, where in a structure does the complementizer sit? Well, the first observation to make is that complementisers are clearly words. They're not phrases by themselves. You can't expand them into anything more than the word themselves. And given that complementizer are words, then that leads us to the conclusion that they must be heads, because in X-bar theory, the only position you can find a word is in a head position. There are no other positions inside any phrase that isn't the head position that is a word position. Complement position is a phrasal position, specifier position is a phrasal position, adjunct positions are phrasal positions inside sentences. So complementisers must be heads of their own phrase. There must be a complementizer phrase accompanying the complementizer. Now note, there's no spare head position inside the IP because every phrase has only a single head. There can only be one head per phrase, and obviously the head of the IP is the inflection. So the complementizer doesn't sit inside the EP, the IP. There's no position, no head position for it. Therefore, they must head a phrase that is outside of the IP. Final observation, they always precede the IP. Okay, complementizer always comes in front of the IP. You never get the complementizer after the IP. You can't say, I think John won that, or I wonder John won if, or I'm anxious John to win for. Okay, the complementizer never follows the IP, and heads that precede a phrase seem to be in a head-complement relationship, and therefore we can come to the conclusion that the IP is actually the complement of the complementizer. So the IP sits in the complement position inside a CP. Therefore, we have this structure for the clause. Note, the complementizer is a head projecting up a phrase of its own. That head takes the IP as its complement, and inside the IP we have all the usual characters, the subject, the inflection, and the verb phrase. Now note, this suggests that clauses have a two-level analysis. There is a lower part to the clause, which is the IP. That's what we've been looking at so far. And then there is a higher level, an upper level to the clause, which is the CP. Now it seems that these two levels of the clause fulfill different functions. Complementisers, as I've said, are the things which introduce notions of interrogativeness or declarativeness. There's nothing inside the IP to indicate whether the clause is being used as to ask a question or to make a statement. Inside the IP, we don't have anything that is specifically interrogative or declarative. And you can see that by the fact that with the two different interrogative or declarative complementisers, if or that, you have exactly the same IP to follow them. If John will win, or that John will win. John will win doesn't change there. So clearly there's nothing inside IP to determine whether or not the clause is interrogative. That's the function of the CP. Okay, the CP tells us whether or not the clause is to be used as an interrogative or a declarative. Inside the IP, we have other aspects of the meaning of clauses. We have the finiteness distinction, whether the clause is to be interpreted as a finite clause or a non-finite clause, etc., etc. So these two levels of the clause seem to be there for different purposes, expressing different aspects of the meaning of the clause. Okay, so let's take those claims that we've made about complementizers separately and see whether or not we can find actual evidence that they're true. We've claimed that the complementizer is the head, and therefore being a head, it should project its properties to the whole clause. Is that true? Well, we've seen that we can get different types of complementizers introducing different types of clauses. For example, we've seen this distinction between interrogative and declarative clauses. That introduces a declarative clause, and if introduces an interrogative clause. Now, we've seen those are not features of inflectional phrases. There's nothing in the inflectional phrase that determines whether or not the clause is interrogative or declarative. Therefore, these features must appear on whatever it is which includes the inflectional phrase, and that is the CP. So when you've got that, the whole CP is minus interrogative, minus WH. Okay, that's a declarative clause. On the other hand, if you've got if, then the whole clause is plus WH. Now, how does the clause get those features? Well, there's a straightforward device that we know about, and that is projection. That is, if we have an interrogative complementizer, it projects its properties up to the next level. So if the complementizer is plus WH, then the X bar level will be plus WH. And if the X bar level is plus WH, then the X double bar, the phrasal level, will be plus WH. So it looks as though then different complementizers project their properties onto the phrase that they head, which is again exactly what you would expect of a head, because it's heads that project properties to phrases. Okay, what about the claim that the IP is the complement of the complementizer? Well, we motivated that on the fact that the complementizer always precedes the IP, but is there any other reason to believe that? Remember, the relationship between a head and its complement is a restrictive relationship. Heads place restrictions on their complements. Now, complementizers only ever precede inflection phrases. You never get a complementizer in front of a DP or a VP or a preposition phrase or any other phrase. So in that sense, complementizers are like other functional heads. Remember, functional heads have extremely limited complements. I always has a VP complement, D always has an NP complement, where it looks as though complementizers, C, only ever have IP complements. So again, there seems to be a restrictive relationship, a very restrictive relationship between the functional complementizer and its complement, the IP. However, moreover, we've seen that there is a restriction relationship that goes even further than that, because it depends on which particular complementizer you're using. If you use that, or if, then the inflection phrase that follows it must be finite. It's got to have an inflection which is either a modal or a tense. That means that if you've got a finite inflection, by projection, you're going to get a finite IP, okay, because the head projects its properties. A finite inflection will give you a finite IP, and the complementizer that seems to want a finite IP as its complement. On the other hand, for has to have a non-finite complement headed by a non-finite inflection. Okay, so again, we then see different complementizers impose different selectional restrictions on the IP that follows them. And given that selectional restrictions are what follow from a head-complement relationship, it looks as though the IP is the complement of the complementizer. Now then, not every clause has a complementizer. We've seen that in certain embedded clauses, you don't have to have a that complementizer. Main clauses, however, never have complementizers. You can't have a complementizer if the clause is not embedded. So John will leave as a main clause can't be introduced by any complementizer. You can't say that John will leave or if John will leave. You only get complementizers embedded clauses. So that raises the question then, what's the status of a main clause? Is it just simply an IP because there's no complementizer? Or could we claim it to be a complementizer phrase? It's just that you can't see the complementizer. The complementizer is phonologically empty, unpronounced. The same question arises for those cases where the complementizer doesn't appear in an embedded situation. So with the complementizer that we've seen, you can either pronounce it or not have it at all. So I think that John will leave or I think John will leave, both are perfectly okay. Now, is that the case that whenever you've got a complementizer there, you've got a CP, obviously, because if there's a head, there's got to be a phrase associated with it. But when there's no head, is the clause just an IP? It could be that there is a C there, but again, it's unpronounced. The question is, how can we tell whether or not there is something there that you can't see? Because obviously, if you can't see it, it's going to be difficult to tell whether it's there or not. Well, there is actually ways of arguing for one of these analyses. The options are this. When there's no complementizer, there's no CP. Therefore, the clause just has the status of an IP. Or, when there's no complementizer, the complementizer is not pronounced, but it's still there. Therefore, the clause has the status of a CP. How can we work out which one of those is the best? Okay, if we assume that there's no complementizer, when there's no complementizer phrase, then we have to assume that verbs like think can take either a CP or an IP complement. Now, what complements verbs take is a lexical property. Different lexical verbs take different complements. Okay, so we would have to say that this is a lexical property of the verb to think, that it can either take a CP or an IP complement. Turns out that this is also a lexical property of the verb to know, because that can also take a CP or an IP complement. You can either pronounce the that or leave it out and say, I know John will leave, or I know that John will leave. It's also a property of believe. I believe that John will leave. I believe John will leave. And hope. I hope that John will leave. I hope John will leave. Regret. Suppose. Demand. In fact, any verb that can take a CP complement with that can take an IP complement without that. Now, if this is true of any verb, it doesn't look as though this is a lexical property, because lexical properties are idiosyncratic. You would expect if verbs could choose between what kinds of complements that they could take, there should be some verbs that would take only a CP complement, i.e. verbs that would always have to have the that pronounced, or there should be verbs which only take IP complements, i.e. verbs for which that can never be present. But it turns out that that's not the case. All verbs that can take a clause or complement beginning with that can take a clause or complement that doesn't begin with that. So that doesn't seem to be a lexical property. It seems to be a general property, a property that must follow not from any specific property of a particular word, but of a general statement. It seems, generally speaking, the complementizer that can either be present or absent. So how do we account for that? Well, the easiest way to account for it is to say, well, this is a fact about the complementizer that. You can either pronounce it or leave it unpronounced. And if you pronounce it, then you've got the that version. If you don't pronounce it, then you've got the version without the that. However, if it's there, but unpronounced, then the clause is clearly still going to be a CP, because there is a complementizer there, it's just that you don't pronounce it. So therefore we have here an argument on the basis of the fact that it's a general property, not a specific property of particular verbs, that you can miss out the complementizer. And that leads us then to the conclusion that all embedded clauses are CPs, whether or not you can see the complementizer. And of course, that jibes well with the observations that previously we've made, that it really is only the complementizer that appears to be optional, and then only in certain positions. With all other complementizers and with all other positions, complementizers are not optional, they are obligatory. So that would lead us to the conclusion that actually all embedded clauses are CPs. And here then is an example where you can't miss out the complementizer that. But what about main clauses? They never have complementizers. Are we to say that they do have complementizers, but they are always silent, unpronounced? Well, one argument to suggest that that is correct comes from the fact that the function of complementizers is to determine the distinction between interrogatives and declaratives. Now, a clause like John will leave is clearly declarative, but we've seen there's no part of the IP that can determine whether or not something is declarative or interrogative. So the fact that John will leave is a declarative clause means that there must be a CP there. There's got to be something to determine that the clause is declarative. And therefore we've got another argument as to why when you can't see the complementizer, you still have to assume that the complementizer is there. The conclusion that we come to generally then is that all clauses are CPs, and therefore when we draw the structure of a clause, the topmost level is going to have to be a CP. Whether or not you actually can see a visible complementizer is irrelevant. The complementizer is there for all clauses. You can just leave some of them out in terms of their pronunciation. Okay, so just to recap then what we've covered in this presentation. CPs have exactly the same structure as all other phrases. They conform to the X-bar principles. They have heads, those heads project up to 2 bar levels, and those heads take a complement which is an IP. That is an extremely restricted relationship between the complementizer and its IP complement, as we would expect, because restriction is what complements and heads having to do with each other. Another conclusion we've come to is that all clauses are CPs. So from now on, we're going to assume that above every IP, there is a CP level. And that CP level is to do with the force of the sentence. That's what we call the distinction between interrogative and declarative. That's the use of the sentence. Are you going to use it to ask a question, or are you going to use it to make a statement? Finally, we've seen that, well, complementizers can be left unpronounced. That's not so much of a surprise because some inflections are unpronounced. For example, certain tense inflections don't have a pronunciation. Some of them do. We have ud, for example, as a pronunciation of past tense, and certain present tenses, when you've got the third person singular subject, you've got s as the pronunciation of the tense. But in other cases, there's no pronunciation of an inflection. So the fact that you can have non-pronounced complementizers shouldn't really be a surprise. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you in class and we can discuss any problems you have with this presentation. Okay, bye-bye.